Welcome, dear listener. So glad you're here tonight. Truly, not because I need an audience, but because stories like this one were never meant to be told into the void, or meant to be shared gently like a secret past between friends long after the world has gone quiet. Maybe you're sitting alone in your room, the soft glow of your screen, the only light in the space. Your dog curled at your feet, breathing that slow, steady rhythm that only animals seem to master. Maybe you've just finished another long session editing footage, your mind still humming with cuts, transitions, and the quiet frustration of a render that won't quite behave. Or maybe you're simply looking for a place to resonate, to learn, not to be impressed, but just to be, while someone else carries the weight of the story for a while. Whatever brought you here, thank you. Thank you for trusting me with your attention, your silence, even your sleep. Because this isn't a performance, it's a companionship. And in a world that never stops shouting, sometimes the most radical thing we can do is listen softly, slowly, without expectation. Now, before we step into the shadow of the Colosseum, let's talk about power and the way it hides in plain sight. If you've seen the trailers for the new Gladiator sequel, you've probably noticed Pedro Pascal seated on a marble throne, draped in purple silk, eyes sharp as flint, voice smooth as aged wine. He's not the one fighting in the sand. He's the one deciding who gets to fight, who deserves to die, and who might live long enough to earn the crowd's applause. And honestly, that's far closer to the truth than most of us realize. Because the real engine of the arena wasn't the gladiator's sword, it was the emperor's silence. The senator's bet, the merchant's coin, the collective hunger of a city that needed distraction more than it needed justice. Rome didn't fall in a day, but it bled slowly, quietly, through the cracks of its own entertainment. And yet, even as we watch Pascal's character weave his political webs from the imperial box, we rarely ask, who were the men he sent into the ring? Not heroes, not rebels, just people, some enslaved, some desperate, some surprisingly willing, who turned their bodies into currency so the empire could keep dreaming it was eternal. So tonight, we won't be watching from the throne. We'll be kneeling in the dust. We'll listen not to the roar, but to the breath that came just before it. So, dear listener, take a slow breath. Let it fill your lungs like warm air rising through the stone corridors of an ancient bathhouse. Let your shoulders drop and clench your jaw. If your eyes are open, let them rest on nothing in particular. If they're closed, imagine the golden light of a Roman afternoon spilling over the travertine walls of the Flavian amphitheater, catching the dust motes in the air like tiny stars suspended in time. There's no rush here. No need to keep up or remember everything. This story isn't racing anywhere. It's simply here, waiting for you to drift into it, like stepping into a cool river on a summer day. You don't have to swim. Just let the current carry you. Think of this narrative as a series of quiet rooms, each one softly lit, each one filled with textures you can almost touch. The rough weave of a gladiator's tunic, the metallic temps of blood on hot stone, the distant murmur of a crowd that hasn't yet decided whether to cheer or weep. History isn't always about grand events. Sometimes it's about the weight of a wooden practice sword in a boy's hand at dawn, or the sound of chains being unlocked for morning drills, or the way a man might whisper a prayer in a language no one else in the arena understands. Those are the moments we'll linger on, not because they change the world, but because they remind us that the world is made of people, not monuments. Over the next 2 hours, we'll wander through 10 quiet chapters, each one a window into another layer of this world. We all begin long before the Colosseum was even imagined, back to a time when Rome was still a city of brick and mud, not marble and myth and funeral games were. Small, solemn affairs meant to honor the dead, not thrill the living. We'll step inside the ludus, the gladiator school, not as tourists, but as silent witnesses, watching men train not just their muscles, bet their minds, their loyalty, their ability to look death in the eye and still stand tall. We'll spend a full day at the amphitheater, not just the fight, but the hours before, the vendors selling lentils and wine, the gamblers scribbling odds on wax tablets, the children climbing the steps with wide eyes, the slaves sweeping the corridors, the priests offering quiet prayers to gods who may or may not be listening. We'll meet the different kinds of gladiators, the Murmillo with his heavy shield, the Retiarius with his net and trident, the Secutor chasing him like fate itself, and we'll ask not who won, but what it cost them to play their part. We'll feel the weight of the emperor's thumb, yes, but also the silence of the crowd when it refused to cheer. We'll sit with the aftermath, the sweep of the broom, the washing of the sand, the way a name could vanish before the sun set. And in the final chapters, we'll ask not just what the arena meant to Rome, but what it still whispers to us today. In our stadiums, our screens, our endless appetite for stories where someone must lose so someone else can feel alive. If you'd like, hit subscribe, but only if this feels like a space you'd want to return to. No pressure, no urgency, just a quiet invitation to keep exploring history together, one gentle story at a time. Now, let us begin where all great stories do, not with a battle cry, not with a crown, but with an ordinary morning in an ordinary city, long before the sand turned red. Imagine the early morning light, not the sharp, golden glare of high noon, but the soft, milky glow that slips between rooftops just before the world fully wakes. In this hour, Rome is not yet an empire, not yet a legend carved in marble, but a city of breath and brick, of cobblestones still damp from the night's dew and alleyways that smell of wet clay, wood smoke, and yesterday's bread. The year is 264 BCE, or perhaps a little earlier. No one is counting with urgency yet. The Tiber flows quietly to the west, its surface shimmering like hammered bronze under the rising sun. And along its banks, fishermen haul in their nets while washerwomen kneel on flat stones, scrubbing tunics with lye and river water. Somewhere in the Suburra, a baby cries, a dog barks, a pot clatters to the floor, and no one minds, because this is not chaos. This is life, ordinary and unguarded, unfolding in the rhythm of a city that still believes it has time. There are no arenas here, no crowds roaring for blood, no men training to die beautifully. There is only the slow pulse of daily existence, the creak of a cartwheel, the murmur of neighbors sharing news over a shared wall, the distant chime of a blacksmith's hammer beginning his day. This is Rome before spectacle, before performance, before violence became a language the public could understand. In this silence, something fragile and precious still lingers, the belief that a life, any life, is worth more than a moment's entertainment. At this time, Roman funerals are intimate affairs, woven into the fabric of family and memory, rather than public display. When a man dies, whether a farmer from the countryside or a modest shopkeeper from the Aventine, his body is washed by his closest kin, wrapped in a simple shroud, and carried to the family tomb just outside the city walls, where the living are not permitted to dwell. His children might place a small offering at the entrance, a bowl of lentils, a cup of wine, a lock of their own hair. If he was a soldier, his comrades might stand in silence for a moment, heads bowed, hands resting on their swords not in salute, but in shared sorrow. There are no games held in his honor, no hired fighters clashing in the dust to prove his greatness. His worth is measured not by how many people watched him die, but by how many wept when he was gone. Death is still a threshold, not a stage, and the gods those quiet, watchful presences who live in hearths and crossroads and the roots of old trees are believed to care more about sincerity than showmanship. To turn grief into theater would not only be tasteless, it would be dangerous. The ancestors, after all, are always listening, and they do not forgive arrogance lightly. Entertainment in this early Rome is modest, communal, and deeply tied to the cycles of the year and the needs of the community. During the fairy, Latina families climb the Alban hills to share a meal of roasted lamb and barley cakes in honor of Jupiter. In the heat of summer, children gather in the shade of olive trees to play tail-knuckle bones tossed like dice while their elders sip watered wine and debate the price of grain or the latest rumor from the Senate. Plays are performed not in grand stone theaters, but on temporary wooden stages erected in the forum for religious festivals. Their actors wearing simple masks and speaking lines borrowed from Greek tragedies or homegrown comedies about clever slaves and foolish masters. Even these performances are not shows in the modern sense. They are offerings to the gods, acts of civic duty as much as amusement. People attend not to escape their lives, but to reaffirm them, to laugh at shared follies, to weep at shared losses, to feel, for a few hours, that they belong to something larger than themselves. There is no separation between audience and performer, no darkened room where strangers sit in silence. Everyone knows someone on stage, or knows someone who knows them. And in that closeness, there is safety, even joy. The Roman household, or domus, is the true center of life, not the forum, not the senate, not the battlefield. Here, in rooms lit by oil lamps and warmed by small braziers, generations live under one roof. Grandfathers tell stories of the old wars, not to glorify violence, but to teach caution. Mothers grind grain on stone querns, their hands rough but steady, while daughters learn to spin wool into threads so fine it could pass through a ring. Even slaves, though bound by law and circumstance, are often treated as part of the extended family. Eating the same food, sharing the same roof, sometimes even buried in the same tomb. This is not kindness born of modern morality, but of necessity and tradition. In a world without institutions, loyalty is the only currency that holds. To abuse those under your roof is to invite misfortune not from the law, which rarely intervenes, but from the gods of the household, the Lares and Penates, who watch over every meal, every birth, every whispered prayer. In such a world, the idea that one might force two men to fight to the death for the amusement of strangers would not only be shocking, it would be sacrilegious. Violation of the very order that keeps the home, and by extension the city, intact. Public space in early Rome is not designed for spectacle, but for exchange. The forum is a marketplace first, a political square second. Here you can buy fish from Astia, pottery from Etruria, or a new pair of sandals from a cobbler who's been plying his trade on the same corner for 30 years. Scribes sit at folding tables drafting wills and contracts for those who cannot write. Priests tend small shrines tucked between shops, offering incense to Mercury for merchants, or Vesta for bakers. People do not come here to be entertained, they come to live. And because everyone knows everyone, or at least knows of them, there is a kind of social accountability that no law can enforce. A man who cheats his neighbor will find his stall empty the next day. A woman who speaks ill of another will hear silence when she calls for help. This is not a utopiate, is messy, unequal, often unjust, but it is held together by threads of familiarity, and those threads are strong. In such a world, anonymity is rare, and with it, the kind of detached cruelty that allows one to watch another suffer without feeling complicit. Religion is not a separate sphere of life, but the air people breathe. Every act, planting a field, crossing a river, giving birth, has its accompanying ritual, its small offering, its whispered invocation. The calendar is marked not by birthdays or anniversaries, but by festivals, the Lemuria. When fathers walk barefoot through their homes at midnight to banish restless spirits, Matronalia. When women receive gifts and are served by their husbands in honor of Juno, it's the Compitalia. When entire neighborhoods gather at crossroad shrines to honor the spirits of the dead with honey cakes and garlands of wool, these are not performances for an audience. They're acts of maintenance, ways of keeping the world in balance, of ensuring that the gods remain benevolent, that the ancestors stay at peace, that the crops grow and the children thrive. To introduce violence into such a system, especially staged, ritualized violence, would be like pouring salt into a sacred spring. It would not just pollute the water. It would break the covenant between the living, the dead, and the divine. And yet, even in this world of order and ritual, the seeds of change are already stirring, not with a crash, but with a whisper. As Rome expands beyond the Italian peninsula, its victories bring more than land and treasure. They bring people, thousands of them ripped from their homes in Gaul, Iberia, Thrace, and sold in the slave markets of the Forum Boreum. These are not abstract enemies. They are men with names, languages, memories. Some are warriors who once led armies. Others are farmers who never held a sword. But in Rome, they are reduced to a single word: service. Their presence begins to shift the city's soul. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands. The old families, once proud of their modesty, now compete in displays of generosity that border on excess. A funeral is no longer just a farewell. It becomes an opportunity to show how much one can afford to lose. And in that competition, a dangerous idea takes root. What if mourning could also be magnificent?
What if loss could be turned into spectacle, and spectacle into power?
It begins almost innocently. In 264 BCIA date, that will later be marked as the birth of the gladiatorial games, a nobleman named Decimus Junius Brutus holds funeral rites for his father. To honor the old man's military service, Brutus arranges for 3 pairs of slaves to fight in a mock duel near the family tomb. Not to the death, just a display of skill, like the athletic contests held in Greece. The crowd is small, neighbors, relatives, a few curious passers-by, but they are captivated. Not by the blood, there's little of that, but by the drama. The tension, the sense that they are witnessing something rare and raw. No one calls it entertainment. They call it munusa, duty, a gift to the dead. But the line has been crossed. What was once private is now public. What was once sacred is now shareable. And once something is shared, it can be copied, amplified, commodified. Over the next decades, the munera grow larger, more elaborate, more competitive. A rival family sponsors a funeral with 10 pairs of fighters. Another adds music, trumpets, and drums to heighten the drama. Soon, politicians realize these games are not just about honoring the dead. They are about winning favor with the living. A young man seeking office might sponsor a munus, not for his father. For a distant ancestor, any excuse will do as long as the crowd remembers his name. The fighters are no longer just slaves. Some are prisoners of war. Others are free men desperate enough to sign a contract that promises food, shelter, and a chance at fame if they survive. The crowd begins to choose favorites, to place bets, to cheer not for the dead, but for the living. And no one seems to notice the shift because everyone is having such a good time. But in the silence between the cheers, something ancient is dying. The belief that a human life cannot be turned into a show. Rome is still peaceful in its way. The streets are safe at night. Children still play in the alleys. But the soul of the city is changing. The values that once held it together, duty, modesty, reverence for the unseen, are being replaced by something louder, brighter, more immediate. The crowd begins to expect spectacle. The powerful begin to deliver it, and the men who will soon become gladiators. They are still just men, afraid, hopeful, tired, unaware that their bodies will soon be the currency of a new kind of Roman dream. They do not yet know that their sweat will be the city's perfume, their blood its wine, their deaths its lullaby. But the stage is being built not with stone, but with silence. The silence of those who look away, who say nothing, who simply enjoy the show. As the sun sets on this early Rome, the streets grow quiet again. Lamps are lit, doors are closed, the city folds into itself like a tired child. But something has shifted. Beneath the surface of daily life, a new hunger is stirring, not for bread or safety, but for drama, for emotion, for proof that life matters enough to be watched. And soon that hunger will find its stage, not in a temple, not in a senate, but in a patch of open ground where the sand is still clean and waiting. Imagine a late afternoon in the year 264 BCE, just beyond the sacred boundary of Rome, the Pomerium, where the city of the living ends and the realm of the ancestors begins. The air is still warm from the sun, but already carries the cool breath of evening, scented with myrtle, rosemary, and the faint resinous smoke of funeral incense curling upward from small clay braziers placed before a family tomb. The tomb belongs to Marcus Junius Pera, a man of modest distinction, a veteran of the wars against the Etruscans, now returned to the earth from which his family once sprang. His sons stand nearby, draped in dark woolen togas, their faces composed not in theatrical sorrow, but in the quiet gravity of duty. This is not a spectacle. It is a munusa gift, an obligation, a sacred debt owed by the living to the dead. And as the last light gilds the cypress trees that line the road to the Esquiline Gate, 3 pairs of men step into the open space before the tomb, slaves. All of them barefoot, clad in simple tunics dyed the color of dust. Their arms bound not with iron, but with leather straps that hold wooden swords and wicker shields. They do not glare at one another. They do not posture. They bow first to the tomb, then to each other, and begin to move not with the fury of enemies, but with the precision of dancers rehearsing a ritual older than memory. No one in the small gathering, perhaps 30 souls, mostly kin and neighbors, expects blood. No one wants it. Yet in this quiet performance, in this act of filial piety disguised as combat, history takes its first irreversible step toward the arena. The sand beneath their feet is still clean, but it will not remain so for long. Moments so small, so private, so easily lost to time marks the first recorded instance of what would, over centuries, evolve into the gladiatorial games. It did not emerge from cruelty, nor from a hunger for violence, but from a deeply rooted Roman belief that the dead required offerings to find peace in the afterlife. Just as a farmer might pour wine onto the soil to thank the earth for its bounty, so too did a son pour effort, honor, and symbolic struggle onto the grave of his father to ensure his spirit would not wander restlessly. In earlier centuries, such offerings had been animals: a bull for a general, a goat for a merchant, a dove for a child. But Rome was a martial society. Its gods were warriors. Its heroes were soldiers. Its highest virtue was virtue's courage in the face of danger. And so, in a culture that revered the disciplined body and the controlled mind, it was perhaps inevitable that human combat would come to be seen not as barbarism, but as the most potent offering of all. To stage a fight in honor of a warrior was not just respectful, it was resonant. It echoed the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, the discipline he had embodied. And yet, even in this reverence, a dangerous ambiguity took root. If the dead could be honored by watching men risk their lives, then perhaps the living could be honored by watching men lose them. For decades indeed, for nearly a century, these funeral games remained modest, confined to the elite, and strictly tied to the death of a specific individual. They were not public events, nor were they meant to entertain. They were acts of familial duty, performed quietly, often at dawn or dusk, away from the bustle of the city. Yet even in their restraint, they carried within them the seed of transformation. Each time a son chose to honor his father with fighters rather than with song or sacrifice, he also made a statement about his own status, his wealth, his influence, his ability to command not just resources but lives. The crowd, though small, began to notice. They whispered about the grace of a Thracian captive who moved like water around his opponent, or the stoic silence of a Gaul who never cried out, even when struck hard. These men had no names in the official records. They were property, not persons, but in the memory of those who watched. They began to acquire something perilously close to identity. And in that fragile recognition, first thread of fame was spun not for emperors or generals, but for men who were, by law, less than human. The paradox was already forming. The more disposable a life was deemed by society, the more captivating it became to watch it risked, performed, and eventually lost. Rome's wars multiplied against Carthage, against the Gauls, against the kingdoms of the Hellenistic East. The flood of captives into the city grew into a torrent. Entire cities were sold into slavery after defeat. Soldiers who had once commanded legions in foreign lands now found themselves chained in the markets of the Forum Boarium. Their armor replaced by rough tunics, their names erased, their pasts reduced to a price tag shouted by an auctioneer. Among these thousands, a select Futhos with unusual strength, bearing, or appearance were purchased, not for minds or households, but for something new: the ludus, the gladiator school. These were run by men known as lanistae, a word that carried connotations of both trainer and pimp, for they dealt in flesh as much as in skill. The lanista was not a nobleman, but a businessman operating in the gray space between religious custom and public appetite. He housed his fighters in fortified compounds that resembled barracks more than homes, fed them a high-protein diet of barley and beans, earning them the nickname hordary, or barleymen, and trained them not just to fight, but to perform, to fall with dignity, to salute before combat, to make their struggle beautiful. Because beauty, even in violence, is what the crowd would soon begin to crave more than blood. The shift from private ritual to public event was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow erosion of a riverbank. A politician running for the office of aedile might sponsor a munus, not for a deceased relative, but in honor of the gods or for the well-being of the republic, convenient fictions that allowed him to stage games without the burden of actual mourning. The crowd, increasingly restless in a city growing ever more crowded, unequal, and anonymous, responded with quiet enthusiasm. What had once been a somber duty became a social occasion. Vendors set up stalls selling wine diluted with seawater, roasted chickpeas, and honey cakes. Children played tag at the edges of the fighting ground. And bets were quietly exchanged on which fighter would win, not out of malice, but out of the universal human desire to feel involved in a story. No laws were broken. No traditions were openly defied, but the meaning had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. The dead were no longer the audience. The living were. And the fighters, once offerings to the underworld, were becoming actors in a drama no one had written, but everyone wanted to watch. By the late Republic, the scale of these games had exploded beyond recognition. In 105 BCE, the consuls Publius Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus staged a moonuse so vast it required the construction of a temporary wooden amphitheater near the forum and featured over 300 pairs of gladiators. The event lasted for days. People traveled from neighboring towns, sleeping in the streets or in makeshift camps, just to witness it. Poets composed verses about the valor of certain fighters. Critics like the elder Cato grumbled that it was excessive on Roman, a sign of moral decay. But the people did not care. They had tasted spectacle, and it was sweet. More importantly, it was theirs, a rare moment in a rigidly hierarchical society when a baker, a slave, and a senator all shared the same gasp, the same collective breath held in suspense, the same surge of emotion. In a world where most had no voice in politics, no power over their own lives, the arena offered a strange kind of participation, the power to cheer, to boo, to decide with their voices whether a man lived or died. And that illusion of agency was intoxicating. Yet beneath the roar of the crowd, a quiet transformation was taking place in the fighters themselves. Some began to see their role not as a sentence, but as a path. A skilled gladiator could earn prize money, gifts from admirers, even the wooden sword of freedom, the rudies after years of service. Graffiti uncovered in Pompeii shows fans scrawling the names of their favorites on walls with the fervor of modern sports enthusiasts. Celadus, the Thracian, heartthrob of the girls. Or Crescens, netman, lover of all night. These were not just bodies in the sand. They were personalities, icons, even objects of desire. A few, like the legendary Spartacus, would later turn that fame into rebellion, leading a slave uprising that shook the Republic to its core. But most simply survived, one fight at a time, trading blood for bread, pain for a chance to be seen, to be remembered, if only for an afternoon. And in that trade, they became something new, not slaves, not soldiers, but gladiators, a class unto themselves, bound by oath, by training, and by the unspoken understanding that their lives belonged to the arena as much as to their masters. The Roman state, ever pragmatic, watched this evolution with cautious interest. At first, it tried to regulate the games, limiting the number of fighters a private citizen could sponsor, banning them during election seasons, even outlawing them entirely for brief periods under moralizing emperors or senators. But the people resisted. To take away the games was to deny them a ritual they had come to see as their right, as essential as bread or water. So instead of suppressing them, the Republic and later the Empire learned to harness them. Politicians used them to win votes. Generals used them to celebrate victories. Emperors would later use them to pacify the masses, to distract them from hunger, inflation, or political unrest. The arena became a tool not of religion, but of power. And the blood spilled in it was no longer an offering to the dead, but a lubricant for the machinery of control. The moonuse had died. In its place stood the spectaculum, pure, polished, and utterly political. What's striking, looking back, is how little fanfare accompanied this revolution. There was no decree, no grand announcement, no philosopher lamenting the fall of piety in a public square. It happened slowly, through 1,000 small choices: a son wanting to honor his father more grandly than his neighbor, a lanista seeing profit in pain, a crowd choosing to cheer rather than mourn, a senator realizing that a well-timed gift of games could buy loyalty more effectively than a speech. History rarely turns on a single moment, turns on 1,000 whispers, each one saying, just this once, and then just a little more, and then, why not? By the time anyone noticed what had been lost, the sanctity of death, the dignity of the individual, the boundary between sacred and spectacle, it was too late. The sand was already stained, not just with blood, but with the slow erosion of meaning. And yet, even in this new world of mass entertainment, traces of the old ritual remained, like fossils embedded in stone. Gladiators still saluted the sponsor before fighting, raising their weapons in a gesture that once meant I offer my life, but now meant I perform for you. They still wore armor that echoed the enemies. Rome had defeated Thracians with curved swords and small shields, Samnites with plumed helmets and oblong shields, Gauls with long swords and bare chests, as if each bout were a miniature reenactment of imperial conquest, a way of reliving Rome's victories in microcosm. The crowd still fell silent at the moment of death, as if remembering, however faintly, that this was once sacred ground. These gestures were no longer meaningful in their original sense, perhaps, but they were comforting. They gave the violence a shape, a story, a reason. And in a world increasingly chaotic, even a false reason is better than none. As the Republic crumbled under the weight of its own ambition, torn apart by civil wars, assassinations, and the rise of men like Caesar and Pompey, the games grew ever more elaborate, more theatrical, more detached from their origins. Wooden arenas gave way to stone. Fights to the death became more common, not because audiences demanded it, in fact. Evidence suggests many preferred mercy, but because sponsors sought to outdo each other in generosity and shock. A man who spared his opponent might be booed by rivals in the crowd. One who killed cleanly, efficiently, without drama, might be applauded. The moral compass had flipped. Mercy was seen as weakness, efficiency as virtue, and through it all the gladiators adapted. They formed brotherhoods within the ludus, calling each other brother in a world that denied them kinship. They developed codes of honor, refusing to strike a fallen man, helping a wounded opponent to his feet. They found ways to assert their humanity in a system designed to erase it. Their resistance was not always loud. Sometimes it was as quiet as a shared meal of barley porridge at dawn, a whispered prayer to a foreign god, a refusal to look afraid as they stepped into the light. As the sun sets on this chapter of Rome's story, the arena is no longer a patch of ground outside the city walls. It is an idea promised that pain can be beautiful, that death can be controlled, that chaos can be turned into order with enough sand and enough blood. The first games were small, almost accidental, born of grief and duty. But they opened a door, and once opened, it could not be closed. The world had tasted spectacle, and it would never be satisfied with silence again. Now, the stage is set, not just for fighters, but for the men who will build them, empires of stone and shadow. The ludus awaits, its gates heavy, its corridors echoing with the sound of wooden swords clashing in the dark. Imagine the first step through the heavy wooden gate of a ludus, not the grand schools of imperial Rome, but an early compound on the outskirts of Capua or Pompeii, surrounded by high walls and silence. The air inside is thick with the smell of sweat, olive oil, and damp earth. There are no cheers here, no crowds, no music, only the rhythmic thud of wooden swords striking shields, the low murmur of instructions in Latin or broken Greek, and the occasional groan of a man pushed beyond his limit. This is where the transformation begins, not with glory, but with exhaustion. The newcomer stands barefoot on the packed dirt, still wearing the rough tunic he was sold in, his wrists raw from chains. His eyes scanning the courtyard, not for danger, but for a place to belong. He does not yet know the names of the men training around him, but he senses their discipline, their fatigue, their quiet camaraderie. He does not yet know he will come to call them brothers. He only knows that this is no longer a market, no longer a ship's hold, no longer a battlefield. This is something worsened, something stranger, a home built on the promise of controlled violence. Most gladiators did not begin as warriors. They began as captive soldiers defeated in foreign wars, rebels crushed in provincial uprisings, or civilians swept up in the chaos of conquest. Others were criminals condemned to the arena as punishment, their crimes ranging from theft to treason. A smaller, more surprising group were free men, poor citizens, debtors. Even former soldiers who signed contracts with Lannister in exchange for food, shelter, and the faint hope of fame or fortune. These contracts, called octoramentum, were legally binding oaths in which the man surrendered his body to his trainer for a set period, often 2 to 5 years. In return, he received training, medical care, and a share of any prize money. It was not freedom, but it was survival. And in a world where life could be cheap and unpredictable, survival was often enough. The ludus was not a prison in the modern sense. Men could speak, eat together, even form relationships, but it was a cage all the same. Its bars made not of iron, but of expectation, routine, and the ever-present knowledge that one day they would be sent into the sand to fight for strangers. Inside the ludus, life followed a strict rhythm dictated by the sun and the trainer's whistle. Dawn began with cold water poured over the head, a shock to the system, a reminder that the day demanded alertness. Breakfast was simple: barley porridge, sometimes mixed with beans or dried fruit, washed down with watered wine. Then came hours of training, not just in combat, but in performance. Gladiators were taught to move with economy and grace, to make every strike look lethal even when it wasn't, to fall in a way that thrilled the crowd without breaking bones. They practiced with wooden weapons twice the weight of real ones to build strength and endurance. They sparred in pairs, rotating partners to learn different styles. The Murmillo, with his heavy shield and short sword, modeled after Roman legionaries. The Retiarius, light and agile, armed with a net and trident representing the sea. The Secutor, the hunter, designed to chase him down. Each type had its strengths, its weaknesses, its theatrical role in the drama of the arena. The trainer often, a former gladiator himself, watched everything, correcting posture, timing, even facial expression. Don't snarl, he might say, look calm. Let them wonder if you're afraid. Because fear was human, but control was divine. The body of a gladiator was not just trained, it was curated. Diet was carefully managed, high in carbohydrates for energy, rich in protein for muscle repair, supplemented with calcium from charred bones or eggshells to strengthen fractures. Wounds were treated with vinegar, honey, and herbal poultices. Broken limbs were set with splints and given time to heal. Contrary to popular belief, gladiators were not disposable, were valuable assets, expensive to train and replace. A dead gladiator was a financial loss. A living one could fight again, earn prizes, attract fans, even become a trainer himself. Archaeological evidence from Ephesus and Pompeii shows healed fractures, dental care, and signs of long-term physical stress, but also care. These men were not pampered, but they were maintained, like prized horses or finely tuned instruments. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the lanista, to the sponsor, to the crowd. And yet within that ownership, they found ways to assert agency, choosing how to wear their hair, which amulet to carry, whether to fight with fury or restraint. But the ludus was more than a training ground. It was a world unto itself, governed by its own rules, hierarchies, and codes of honor. Newcomers were tested not just in skill, but in character. Could they take a blow without flinching? Could they help a fallen sparring partner? Could they endure mockery without losing composure? Those who passed were gradually accepted into the brotherhood. Meals were shared from a common pot. Stories were told at night of home, of battles, of dreams that felt impossibly distant. Some men formed deep bonds, even romantic ones, in a space where traditional family was forbidden. They called each other contharbernels, tent mates, a term borrowed from the army, implying loyalty unto death. In a society that denied them personhood, the ludus offered something rare: recognition. It's not as slaves, not as criminals, but as men who had chosen or been forced to walk a path few could survive. And in that shared identity, they found dignity, however fragile. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most profound. A man entered the ludus as a prisoner, a victim, a number. He left it on the day of the games as a character. His name might be announced with fanfare: Spiculus the Thracian, or Priscus the Murmillo. His armor would gleam under the sun, his plume would sway with every step, his gaze would be steady as he saluted the sponsor. The crowd would cheer or boo, but they would see him. For a few hours, he was not property, he was a presence. That shift from invisibility to visibility was intoxicating, even addictive. Some gladiators came to crave the roar of the crowd more than freedom. Others fought with quiet resignation, counting the days until their contract ended. But all of them learned to perform a version of themselves that was both real and constructed, brave enough to inspire, vulnerable enough to humanize, skilled enough to survive. It was a tightrope walk between authenticity and artifice, and falling meant more than losing a fight. It meant losing the self they had painstakingly rebuilt. Women, though rare, also trained in some ludi. Roman law officially banned female gladiators by the early 2nd century CE, calling them un-Roman and shameful. But graffiti and mosaics prove they existed, fighting as Amazons, as mythological figures, or simply as themselves. They faced double stigma, as performers and as women who dared to enter a masculine space, yet they persisted, perhaps for the same reasons as their male counterparts. Survival, fame, or the sheer thrill of being seen in a world that told them to stay hidden. Their presence reminds us that the arena was never just about Minette, was about the human desire to transcend circumstance, even if only for an afternoon. Despite the discipline, the routine, the brotherhood, the shadow of death was never far. Every training session was preparation for a moment when the wooden sword would be replaced by steel. When the sparring partner would become an opponent, when the crowd's cheers would decide whether a raised thumb meant life or a lowered one meant the final breath. They knew that even the most skilled could fall to a lucky strike, a twisted ankle, a moment of distraction. And yet they trained. Not out of blind obedience, but out of a strange kind of faith in their bodies, in their brothers, in the idea that if they fought well, they would be remembered if only for a day. That memory was their currency. It's more valuable than coin, more lasting than freedom. The Lanista, for all his pragmatism, understood this. He was not just a businessman. He was a director, a psychologist, a father figure. He knew which men needed encouragement, which needed discipline, which were close to breaking. He mediated disputes, arranged medical care, even negotiated with sponsors for better conditions. His success depended not just on wins, but on stories on creating fighters the crowd would care about. A gladiator who fought with honor, who spared a worthy opponent, who showed courage in defeat, was worth more than 10 who simply killed efficiently. The ludus was thus a factory of myth, producing not just fighters, but legends carefully crafted, emotionally resonant, and utterly human. And yet, even in this world of performance, moments of raw truth broke through. A gladiator might whisper a prayer in his native tongue before entering the arena, might clutch a small charma wolf's tooth, a coin, a scrap of cloth from home as he walked into the light. He might lock eyes with a friend in the crowd and give the slightest nod, a silent farewell. These gestures were not part of the show. They were private, sacred, and fleeting. But they were real. And in them, the man behind the mask reappeared not as a spectacle, but as a soul. As the Republic gave way to empire, the ludi grew larger, more professional, more integrated into the state apparatus. Emperors like Domitian and Commodus built imperial schools, turning gladiators into extensions of imperial power. But the core experience remained the same. A journey from anonymity to visibility, from body to symbol, from slave to something in between. The ludus was where that alchemy happened, not in fire, but in sweat, in repetition. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the only sound was the scrape of a whetstone on steel. As the sun sets on this chapter, the gladiator stands ready not yet in the arena, but on its threshold. He has been shaped by discipline, hardened by pain, and softened by brotherhood. He is no longer the man who entered the ludus, but he is not yet the legend the crowd will cheer for. He is in between, suspended in the fragile space where humanity meets performance. And tomorrow, the sand will decide which side wins. Imagine waking before dawn in a Rome that is already stirring, not with the sharp urgency of labor, but with the soft, anticipatory hum of a city preparing for something it cannot quite name, yet deeply feels in its bones. The sky is still the color of ash and lavender, the stars fading one by one, as if bowing to the coming sun. And the air carries that rare morning coolness that slips through the narrow alleys of the Subura, like a whispered secret. In a small room above a bakery, a mother kneels beside her sleeping child, gently shaking his shoulder. "Today's the day," she says, not with excitement, but with the quiet gravity of someone fulfilling a promise. The boy sits up, rubbing his eyes, already reaching for the tunic she laid out the night before, the one with the blue stripe, saved for special occasions. Downstairs, his father is pulling loaves from the oven. their crusts crackling in the heat, wrapping them in coarse cloth for the vendors who will sell them near the Flavian amphitheater by mid-morning. Elsewhere, in a modest apartment near the Esquiline, a group of young men splash cold water on their faces, slicking back their hair with olive oil, laughing as they mimic the stance of a murmillo they saw in a mosaic last week. No one is rushing.
Oh, no one is shouting.
But beneath the surface of this ordinary morning, there is a current of shared understanding that today the city will not belong to work, to politics, or even to the gods. Today, it belongs to the arena. And for hundreds of thousands of Romans, free and enslaved, rich and poor, citizen and foreigner, this is as close to a holiday as they will ever get. It's not because it is sanctioned by law, but because it is woven into the rhythm of their collective soul. A day when the weight of daily survival can be set down, if only for a few hours, and replaced with the lighter burden of spectacle. By the time the sun has fully risen, painting the rooftops in gold and casting long shadows across the Forum, the streets leading to the Colosseum have transformed into rivers of humanity, not chaotic, but flowing with the patient, purposeful energy of a pilgrimage. Senators arrive in litters carried by teams of slaves, their purple-bordered togas immaculate despite the dust, their faces composed in the practiced neutrality of power, though their eyes betray a flicker of anticipation. After all, even they are human, and even they crave distraction from the endless calculations of governance. Walking beside them, or just behind, are merchants in simple wool tunics, their pockets jingling with copper and silver, not just for food and drink, but for the bets they will place on the day's outcomes. Wagers made not out of greed, but out of the universal desire to feel involved in a story that is not their own. Children dart between legs like minnows in a stream, clutching wooden swords carved by their fathers or older brothers, reenacting imagined battles with shrieks of mock fury that dissolve into laughter before they can become real. Prostitutes lean against sun-warmed columns, offering companionship for the afternoon. Their presence not scandalous but practical reminder that even in a space of ritualized violence, life insists on continuing in all its messy, beautiful forms. Priests move among the crowd, sprinkling holy water at the amphitheater's 80-numbered entrances, blessing the space as if it were a temple which, in many ways, it has become, not to Mars or Jupiter, but to the gods of spectacle, community, and controlled chaos. And the Colosseum itself rises above it all like a mountain carved by human hands, its travertine facade glowing in the morning light, its arches casting deep shadows that seem to swallow sound, its very presence a promise. Today, you will feel something. Inside, the amphitheater reveals itself not as a pit of horror, but as a meticulously engineered microcosm of Roman society, a living map of hierarchy, privilege and belonging rendered in stone and sweat. The lowest tier, closest to the sand, is reserved for the emperor, his family, and the Vestal virgins, seated on marble thrones beneath a vast awning, the velarium hoisted by sailors from the imperial fleet, its linen panels shifting gently in the breeze like the sails of a great ship. Above them, in slightly less opulent seats, sit the senators and equestrians, their white togas forming a sea of elite visibility. Their conversations hushed but animated, as much about politics as about the day's program. Higher still, the middle classes, shopkeepers, artisans, freedmen occupy long wooden benches, their voices louder, their gestures broader, their enjoyment unburdened by the need to appear dignified. They shout greetings to friends across the aisles, share flasks of wine, and debate the merits of different gladiator types with the passion of modern sports fans. At the very top, under the open sky and exposed to the full force of the sun, sit the poor, the slaves, and the women, though respectable matrons often avoid the games altogether. Deeming them unseemly, yet their presence is no less vital. Their cheers are louder, their reactions less restrained, their investment in the outcome perhaps even deeper, for in the arena, even the most powerless can feel the illusion of influence. The seating is not arbitrary. It is a daily reaffirmation of who matters and who watches from the margins. And yet, for a few hours, while eyes, whether shaded by silk or squinting against the glare, turn to the same center, the arena, the sand, the stage where the drama of survival will unfold. In that shared gaze, a strange kind of unity flickers to life, not equality, but communion. The day's program unfolds with the precision of a well-rehearsed symphony, each movement designed to build emotion, release tension, and sustain attention across hours. It begins not with gladiators, but with the Venetians' elaborate hunts of exotic animals brought from the farthest reaches of the empire. Lions from the deserts of Africa, their manes dusted with sand, bears from the forests of Dacia, massive and lumbering, elephants from Syria, their trunks swaying like slow pendulums. Even creatures so rare most Romans have only heard of them in myths: giraffes, with necks like towers, rhinoceroses, armored and living hide. These animals are released into the arena to be hunted by trained venatores, or pitted against each other in staged battles that blur the line between nature and theater. The crowd oohs and ahs, placing bets on which beast will win, laughing when a lion ignores its opponent and lies down in the sun to nap, or when a bear swats a wolf into the air like a child's toy. Between acts, clowns and acrobats perform slapstick routines, tumbling through mock battles or reenacting myths with exaggerated gestures, Hercules wrestling a lion made of straw, Orpheus charming a chorus of dancing goats. There are musical interludes. Trumpets blare fanfares, water organs hum deep chords, flutes weave melodies that mimic birdsong or battle cries. The mood is festive, almost carnival-like. No one is thinking of death yet. They are eating lentils and olives from shared bowls, drinking wine diluted with seawater from communal cups, flirting with strangers, arguing with friends, napping in the shade of the upper tiers. The arena is not a place of horror. It is a public park with stakes, a social hub where the city comes to breathe as one. Then, as the sun reaches its zenith and the heat begins to press down like a heavy hand, a single trumpet blast cuts through the chatter, not loud, but sharp, precise, like a needle pulling thread through fabric. Quah. The crowd falls silent, not out of fear, but out of habit, the way a congregation quiets when the priest approaches the altar. The gates at the eastern end of the arena creak open on oiled hinges, and the first pair of gladiators steps into the light. They do not run, they do not posture. They walk with measured steps, their armor polished to a dull gleam, their weapons held low at their sides, their movements economical, practiced, calm. One is a murmillo, broad-shouldered and steady, his helmet crowned with a fish crest that glints in the sun, large rectangular shield strapped to his left arm like a second skin, his short sword the gladius hanging at his hip. The other is a retiarius, lean and agile, bareheaded so the crowd can see his face, his sweat, his focus, his humanity, his trident held loosely in one hand, his net coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent ready to strike. They stop at the center of the sand, turn toward the imperial box and raise their weapons in salute. Avenue. Imperator, moratori, te salutant, hail, emperor, those who are about to die salute you. The phrase is ritual, not literal. Most gladiators do not expect to die today, but it carries the weight of centuries, a reminder that this is not just sport, but sacrifice, performance, and politics, all woven into one. The emperor, seated in cool shadow, gives a barely perceptible nod. The crowd roars, not a single sound, but a wave of voices rising from every tier, a sound that feels less like noise and more like the city itself, exhaling. And the dance begins. What follows is not chaos, but choreography refined over generations. Every movement is trained, every feint rehearsed, every stumble calculated to heighten drama without risking life unnecessarily. The retiarius darts and weaves, using his speed to stay out of reach, trying to ensnare his opponent's sword or shield with his net, his trident held ready to strike if the opening appears. The murmillo advances steadily, using his heavy shield to block, his short sword to thrust in quick, efficient jabs, his eyes never leaving his opponent's feet, knowing that in the sand, balance is everything. The crowd leans forward as one, breath held, then erupts in cheers or groans with every near miss, every clever dodge, every moment of tension that stretches like a bowstring before releasing. Bets are settled with slaps on the back or muttered curses. The baker shouts encouragement to the murmillo like your mother's stew, solid and true, while a group of boys mimic the retiarius's leaps in the aisles, their wooden swords clacking together in imitation. The fight lasts perhaps 10 minutes, long enough to build narrative, short enough to maintain tension. Oh, no. Blood is drawn. When the Murmillo finally disarms his opponent with a clever twist of his shield, knocking the trident from his grip, the crowd does not demand death. They wave handkerchiefs or raise open palms, signs of mercy, not weakness, but generosity. The editor, the sponsor of the games, seated near the emperor, looks to his superior, who gives a subtle nod. The Retiarius is spared. Both men bow to each other, then to the crowd, then to the emperor, and exit through the gate of life, their heads held high, their bodies trembling not from fear, but from exertion and relief. The sand is raked smooth again by slaves with wide wooden rakes, erasing the footprints, the scuff marks, the story just told, preparing the stage for the next. Not all fights end so gently. Later in the day, as the sun begins its slow descent and the shadows lengthen across the arena, two secutors heavily armored, faceless in their smooth, rounded helmets designed to deflect nets clash in a brutal, grinding duel that feels less like dance and more like siege warfare. Their shields slam together with a sound like thunder, their swords scrape against metal, their breath comes in ragged gasps audible even in the highest tiers. One stumbles, his foot catching in a rut left by an earlier bout, the other raises his sword. The crowd is divided, some shout "Ugla, kill him!" their voices sharp with bloodlust or perhaps just the desire for a clean ending. Others cry "Mit, let him go," their tone pleading, protective, as if the fallen man were their own son. The editor hesitates, weighing the mood, the cost, the optics. Then he gives the signal, thumb turned down, not with cruelty, but with the weary resignation of a man who knows the crowd must be fed. The victor obeys without flourish, without celebration. He steps forward, places his foot on his opponent's chest to hold him still, and drives the sword down between the ribs, a practiced motion, quick, efficient, designed to end suffering as much as life. The body goes still. The crowd falls silent, not in horror, but in respect, the kind of silence that follows a prayer. Then slowly the murmur returns. The vendors resume their calls. The children stop covering their eyes. A woman wipes her cheeks with the edge of her shawl. Death is part of the rhythm, like rain or sunset. It is not denied. It is integrated, acknowledged, and then set aside so life can continue. Between bouts, the atmosphere shifts again, softening like the light. Musicians play gentle melodies on flutes and lyres, their notes drifting over the sand like leaves on a breeze. Priests in white robes step forward to offer libations to the gods of the underworld. This potter, Libatino, pouring wine onto the sand where the blood has soaked in, whispering prayers for the dead to find peace. Slaves sweep the arena not to hide the evidence, but to prepare the stage for the next story. Their movements rhythmic, almost meditative. The crowd eats, gossips, naps. An old man tells his wide-eyed grandson about the great Spartacus, how he led an army of slaves and nearly brought Rome to its knees. A young woman shares a fig with a stranger, their fingers brushing briefly, a moment of connection in a sea of faces. A senator debates grain prices with a rival, their voices low, their hands gesturing not in anger, but in the familiar dance of negotiation. The arena is not just a place of violence. It is a civic space, a living room for the entire city. In a world without mass media, without radio or screens, the games are the closest thing to a shared cultural experience, more unifying than religion, more immediate than politics. To be absent is to be out of the conversation for days. To miss the jokes, the references, the collective memory being forged in real time. And yet, beneath the surface of this communal joy, quiet tensions simmer like embers under ash. A slave watches the Murmillo, a man like him, yet celebrated, admired, even desired, and wonders what it would feel like to be seen not as property, but as a person. A widow remembers her husband killed in a similar fight years ago. His body never returned to her, and turns her face away, pretending to adjust her veil. A philosopher in the upper tiers, unnoticed by those around him, scribbles in a wax tablet. They cheer for courage, but ignore the system that demands it. They weep for the fallen, but forget the chains that brought him here. The arena reflects Rome in all its contradictions, generous and cruel, orderly and chaotic, inclusive and hierarchical. It offers bread and circuses, yes, but also a mirror, held up not to shame, but to reveal. As the afternoon wears on, and the quality of light shifts from gold to amber. The final bouts are saved for the most famous gladiators, those with nicknames, fan clubs, even endorsement deals with olive oil merchants or sandal makers. When Priscus and Verus fight to a draw in a legendary match under Domitian, the crowd goes wild not for the blood, but for the fairness, the skill, the mutual respect they showed in the sand. Neither man sought to kill, both fought to honor. The emperor, moved, or perhaps simply shrewd, grants both men the rudes, the wooden sword of freedom. They embrace in the center of the arena, their armor clinking softly, their faces streaked with sweat and tears, and for a moment the entire Colosseum stands as one, not as senators and slaves, men and women, citizens and foreigners, but as Romans, united in awe. It is not just a victory. It is a story they will tell for years, a moment when the arena transcended its purpose and became something closer to grace. The games end, not with a bang, but with a slow exhale, like the final note of a long song. The crowd files out, tired but satisfied, carrying leftovers in cloth bundles, humming tunes from the musicians, or playing favorite moments in animated voices. The streets fill with the sound of sandals on stone, laughter, the occasional drunkard singing off-key. A mother holds her child's hand tightly, answering his endless questions about the receiver. A group of friends plan to meet tomorrow to discuss the day's events over wine. The city returns to itself, but changed, however slightly. For a few hours, they were not just individuals scraping by in a vast, indifferent empire. They were Romans. And that feeling, however fleeting, is worth more than the price of admission. As dusk settles over the empty amphitheater, the sand lies still, streaked with sweat, blood, olive oil, and the faint imprint of thousands of footsteps. The velarium is lowered, its linen panels folding like wings. The gates are locked. The last slave sweeps the final corner, then disappears into the tunnels below. But the echoes remain not just of roars, but of shared breath, shared hope, shared humanity. The arena is silent now, but it dreams of the crowd that loved it, that needed it, that saw itself reflected in its sand. Somewhere in a ludus not far away, a gladiator sharpens his sword, listening to the distant hum of the city, waiting for his turn to step into the light. Imagine the quiet just before dawn, inside a ludus, on the outskirts of Capua, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of breathing, of distant footsteps on packed earth, of the soft clink of a water jug being set down on stone. The air is cool and carries the scent of damp wool, olive oil, and yesterday's sweat. A smell so familiar to the men who live here that it no longer registers as unpleasant, but as home. In the dim light filtering through high windows, figures move slowly, deliberately stretching stiff limbs, splashing cold water on their faces, checking the straps of their practice armor. No one speaks much. Words are saved for training, for meals, for the rare moment of vulnerability that only comes in the dark. This is not a barracks in the military sense, nor a prison in the modern one. It is something in between, a place of discipline and danger, yes, but also of unexpected tenderness, where men who entered as strangers learn to trust each other with their lives not because they are ordered to, but because survival demands it and dignity insists on it. Most of these men arrived, broken, shackled, humiliated, stripped of everything that once defined them. A Thracian chieftain who once led raids across the Balkans now sleeps on a straw mat beside a Roman debtor who lost his farm to taxes. A Gaul who fought for his village against Caesar's legions shares a water cup with a North African slave sold at auction after his city fell. They do not speak the same language at first. They do not share gods or customs or memories. But in the ludus, those differences fade, not because they are erased, but because they are overshadowed by a new, shared reality. They are all gladiators now, bound by oath, by routine, and by the unspoken understanding that the man beside you in the sand might be the only one who sees you as human. And so, slowly, carefully, they begin to rebuild not just their bodies, but their sense of self through the quiet acts of daily life, sharing a blanket on a cold night, holding a sparring partner's head while he gags after a hard blow to the stomach, teaching each other words in their native tongues just to make the drills less lonely. The bond that forms in the ludus is not romanticized. It is forged in the crucible of exhaustion, pain, and mutual dependence. Training is brutal, but it is also intimate. Men learn each other's rhythms, the way one favors his left side after a rib injury, the way another flinches at sudden noises, the way a third always smiles before delivering a particularly vicious strike. They spar not as enemies, but as partners in a dance where the goal is not to win, but to prepare. A good sparring session leaves both men stronger, sharper, more alive. And when one stumbles, the other helps him up, not out of pity, but out of respect, because tomorrow it could be you on the ground, and you will need that hand. This reciprocity becomes the foundation of a brotherhood deeper than blood, for blood can be inherited, but this is chosen, again and again, every morning, every time they step onto the training ground together. Meals are shared from a common pot, eaten sitting on low stools or on the ground, elbows touching, laughter rising over the clatter of wooden spoons. The food is simple: barley porridge, beans, dried fish. Sometimes cheese or olives if the lanista has done well with his bets, but it is eaten with the kind of gratitude that only those who have known hunger can feel. Stories are told at these meals, not grand epics, but small human things. A man from Lusitania describes the taste of wild strawberries in his village. Another recalls the sound of his mother singing as she wove wool by lamplight. A third, quieter than the rest, sketches figures in the dirt with a stick as children, he says, though he hasn't seen them in years. These moments are not performances. They are offerings. And in accepting them, the others say, without words, you are still a person. You are still here. But the ludus is not a utopia. Conflict simmers beneath the surface, as it does in any group of men forced into close quarters under stress. Rivalries form not over women or wealth, but over status, over favor from the trainer, over who gets to fight in the next games. A man who wins too often may be resented. One who loses too easily, pitied. Pride is a fragile thing, in a place where your worth is measured by your ability to survive violence. And wounded pride can turn into bitterness, then into sabotage, a loosened strap on a shield. A whispered rumor to the lanista, a shove during drills that looks like an accident. Yet even these tensions are managed, not through punishment but through ritual. Fights are allowed fistfights, not with weapons, and once they are done, both men are expected to share a cup of water. The message is clear: anger is human, but division is dangerous. In the arena, you cannot afford enemies among your brothers. The lanista, for all his reputation as a profiteer, often acts as a reluctant father figure. He knows that a fractured ludus produces weak fighters, so he mediates disputes, assigns sleeping quarters to balance personalities, and sometimes even sits with the men at night, sharing wine and stories of his own time in the sand. Many lanistae were gladiators themselves once, and though they now wear fine tunics and carry account tablets instead of swords, they remember the weight of the helmet, the taste of blood in the mouth, the sound of the crowd deciding your fate. That memory keeps them human, and it earns them a grudging respect. Not love, perhaps, but loyalty. The men know he profits from their pain, but they also know he depends on their survival. It is a strange kind of symbiosis, built on mutual need rather than affection, yet it holds. Women are rarely seen in the ludus, but their presence is felt. Some gladiators keep small tocanza, a carved bead, a scrap of embroidered cloth, a lock of hair hidden in the lining of their tunics or tucked beneath their sleeping mats. These are not always romantic. Sometimes they are reminders of daughters, sisters, mothers left behind. On the rare nights when a woman is allowed to visit perhaps a wife who has not yet abandoned her condemned husband, or a lover from the city, the atmosphere shifts. The men become quieter, more protective, forming a loose circle around the couple to grant them privacy. There is no mockery, no lewdness. Instead, there is a deep, unspoken reverence for the fragility of connection in a world designed to sever it. The most profound bonds form not in victory, but in loss. When a brother falls in the arena and does not return, the ludus mourns in silence. No wailing, no public display, is a shared heaviness in the air, slower pace in the drills, an extra portion of food left at the empty place during meals. Sometimes the men gather at night to whisper his name, to recount his favorite joke, the way he laughed, the scar he was proud of. These rituals are not sanctioned by the lanista. They are invented, passed down, kept alive, because to forget is to admit that his life meant nothing. And in a system that treats them as disposable, remembering becomes an act of resistance. Yet even in this closeness, there is distance. No one asks the question that hangs in the air. Will you be next? Instead, they train harder, eat more, sleep deeper, as if by mastering their bodies, they can outwit fate. They develop private routines. A prayer whispered in a forgotten tongue, specific way of tying their sandal straps, a stone carried in the pocket for luck. These are not superstitions, but anchors small ways of asserting control in a life defined by its absence. And when one man is called to fight, the others do not say goodbye. They simply nod, clap him on the shoulder, and say, "Come back whole." It is the closest they will ever come to saying, "I love you." The ludus is also a place of quiet rebellion. Men teach each other to read using charcoal on broken pottery. They trade news from the outside world, rumors of uprisings, changes in the emperor's court, the price of grain. They dream aloud of freedom not as a fantasy, but as a plan, saving prize money, learning the layout of the city, memorizing the names of sympathetic freedmen who might offer shelter. Spartacus did not rise in a vacuum. He rose from 1,000 such conversations, whispered in the dark, fueled by the belief that another life was possible. Even those who never rebel know the power of that dream. It keeps them human. As the Roman Empire grows more centralized, the ludi become more regulated, more integrated into the state machine. Imperial schools are built with stricter rules, less autonomy, more surveillance. But the core of the brotherhood remains, because no law can dictate how men look at each other after a hard day's training. No emperor can forbid the sharing of bread. No chain can stop a whispered name in the night. The ludus may be a cage, but within it men build a world small, fragile, temporary, but theirs. As dusk settles over the training ground, the men gather for the final drills of the day. The sun casts long shadows across the sand, and the sound of wooden swords clashing echoes off the high walls like a heartbeat. They are tired, sore, hungry, but they are together. And in that togetherness, they find something the arena can never take away. The quiet certainty that, for now, they are not alone. Tomorrow, the gates will open. But tonight, the ludus is home. Imagine the imperial box of the Colosseum not as a seat of power, but as a stage within a stagia, carefully curated island of shadow and silk suspended above the roaring sea of 50,000 souls. The sun is high, pressing down like a hot coin on the back of the neck, but here, beneath the vast linen awning, known as the velarium, the air is cool, scented with rosewater sprinkled on the marble floor, and the faint, clean aroma of cedarwood oil rubbed into the arms of the emperor's throne. He sits not rigidly, but with the relaxed posture of a man who has never known true fear, not because he is brave, but because no one has dared to make him afraid in decades. His fingers rest lightly on the arm of his chair, one tracing the grain of the wood as if reading a secret message carved there by time itself, the other holding a shallow cup of chilled Falernian wine, diluted with snow hauled down from the Apennines at great expense, a luxury not for taste, but for symbolism. Even nature bends to his will. Around him, the world holds its breath. Senators murmur in low tones, their togas immaculate, their faces carefully neutral, though their eyes flicker toward the sand below with the nervous energy of men who know their fortunes hang on a gesture they cannot control. Vestal virgins sit in serene silence, their white veils untouched by the dust of the crowd, their presence a reminder that this is not mere entertainment but ritual. Foreign dignitaries, kings from client states, ambassadors from Parthia, chieftains from Germania watch, with wide eyes, not just at the spectacle below, but at the man in the center, trying to decipher the code of his power. And all of them, every single one, are waiting for the same thing, the almost imperceptible movement of a thumb, the tilt of a chin, the blink of an eye that will decide whether a man who has just fought with every fiber of his being will walk out through the gate of life or be dragged through the gate of death. This is not justice. It is theater. And the emperor is not a judge. He is the author, the director, and the final audience of a story written in sand, sweat, and silence. The power to spare or kill in the arena was never truly about the gladiator's fate. It was about the emperor's image, fluid, strategic, and meticulously managed. From Augustus onward, Roman emperors understood that the games were not merely a distraction for the masses, but a language more potent than laws or legions. A raised thumb could signal clementia mercy, wisdom, eternal benevolence, and reinforce the idea that the emperor was not a tyrant, but a father to his people, willing to forgive even in the face of blood. A lowered thumb, by contrast, could demonstrate Severitis strength, resolve, the unflinching hand that maintains order in a chaotic world. But the gesture itself was rarely spontaneous. It was rehearsed, calculated, often prearranged with the editor of the games, who might be the emperor himself or a trusted ally. What mattered was not the decision, but the performance of deliberation. The pause, the glance at the crowd, the slight furrow of the brow that suggested deep moral weighing. In that suspended moment, the entire city became a single organism, its heartbeat synced to the emperor's breath. And in that unity he reminded them all who held the strings. The crowd, far from resenting this manipulation, leaned into it with gratitude. They wanted to be led. They wanted to believe that anyone was in control of a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. The arena offered them that illusion, and they clung to it like a lifeline. This dynamic was especially vital in a city as vast, dense, volatile as Imperial Rome. By the 1st century CE, the capital housed over 1 million people, citizens, freedmen, slaves. Foreigners packed into towering tenements that swayed in the wind, competing for water from public fountains, bread from state granaries, and a sliver of dignity in a society that measured worth by birth and wealth. The emperor could not feed them all, nor house them, nor guarantee safety from fire, disease, or crime. But he could give them spectacle. He could give them days when the usual hierarchies dissolved into shared emotion, when a baker and a senator both gasped at the same near miss, when a slave and a matron both wept at an act of unexpected mercy. And most importantly, he could give them the illusion of participation. When the crowd roared Jugla, or Mit, they felt they had a voice, that their opinion mattered, that they were part of the machinery of justice. They did not realize that the outcome had often been decided before the fight began, that the editor, acting on the emperor's behalf, had already chosen whether the bout would end in blood or in brotherhood. The vote was a ritual, not a referendum. It's tight. And like all good rituals, it made people feel seen, heard, and valued event, as it reinforced their fundamental powerlessness. It was a quiet contract, renewed every time the sand was raked smooth, in exchange for bread. Spectacle and the illusion of order, the people surrendered their right to question. The emperor's presence in the amphitheater was itself a performance of divine proximity, carefully staged blurring of the line between mortal and immortal. Seated beneath a canopy that mimicked the vault of the heavens, flanked by priestesses of Vesta and statues of Mars and Jupiter, occupied a space that was neither fully political nor fully sacred, but something in between, a liminal zone where earthly power touched the divine. When he entered the Colosseum, trumpets sounded not just in greeting, but in consecration, as if announcing the arrival of a god walking among men. When he raised his hand, it was not merely a signalet. It was a benediction or a curse, delivered from a plane just above the human, witnessed by the gods themselves. This was not accidental theater. It was core to Roman political theology, which had long fused leadership with sacred authority. The emperor was not just princeps first citizen, but pontifex maximus, chief priest, the bridge between the people and the divine. The arena thus became his most public altar, where the gladiator's life was offered not just to the crowd, but to the emperor as proxy for the state, the gods, and the cosmic order. To defy his judgment was not just treason, it was sacrilege, a rupture in the fabric of the world that only he could mend. Yet emperors were not monoliths, and their use of the games revealed their character as much as their strategy. Some, like Trajan, used the arena to project stability, moderate in scale, generous in mercy, always mindful of the Senate's sensibilities, staging games that celebrated military victories without descending into excess. Others, like Caligula, turned the amphitheater into a stage for paranoia and performance, ordering executions on whims, forcing senators to fight as gladiators to humiliate them, or declaring that the only worthy death was one witnessed by him personally, as if proximity to his gaze conferred meaning on the act. And then there was Commodus, who didn't just preside over the games, he entered them, dressed as Hercules, wearing a lion skin and wielding a club instead of a sword. He fought disabled opponents, wounded animals, or men ordered to submit to him, collecting exorbitant fees from the state treasury for each victory. His performances were not about power, but about delusion, a desperate theatrical attempt to prove he was not just ruler, but myth incarnate. The crowd cheered, of course. They always did. But behind closed doors, in the dimly lit taverns and shadowed corridors of the Palatine, the whispers grew louder, more dangerous. The emperor's thumb could command life and death in the sand, but it could not silence the doubt that festered in the hearts of those who saw through the performance. The political utility of the games extended far beyond the capital, radiating outward like ripples in a pond. Provincial governors staged munera in imitation of the emperor, using them to curry favor, display loyalty, or assert local dominance. In cities like Antioch, Carthage, or Alexandria, the amphitheater became a mirror of Roma Place, where imperial values were rehearsed, reinforced, and sometimes subtly questioned. A local magistrate who spared a popular gladiator might win the people's love and secure his position. One who ordered unnecessary deaths might be seen as tyrannical, inviting unrest or even rebellion. The games thus functioned as a feedback loop. Rome set the tone, but the provinces interpreted it, adapted it, and occasionally pushed back. The emperor watched these performances closely through his network of spies and informants. A city that celebrated too wildly might be seen as rebellious, its loyalty suspect. One that showed indifference might be deemed disloyal, its leaders replaced. Even silence could be read as dissent. The arena was not just a place of entertainment. It was a barometer of imperial control, a tool of soft power that required constant calibration. And yet, for all its political weight, the entire system relied on a fragile illusion that the violence was contained, that the blood spilled in the arena would not spill into the streets. The state went to great lengths to maintain this boundary. Gladiators were trained to die cleanly, without screaming, to preserve the dignity of the spectacle. Bodies were removed swiftly through the gate of death by attendants dressed as Charon, the ferrymen of the underworld, who would tap the fallen with a red-hot iron to ensure death, a ritual that sanitized the act, turning murder into myth. The sand was raked smooth between bouts, erasing footprints, bloodstains, evidence like a scribe scraping wax from a tablet. The crowd was encouraged to see the arena as a separate world, a stage where real consequences did not apply, where death was not final but theatrical, but the line was always porous. When Spartacus led his revolt in 73 BCE, he didn't just escape a lunacy, shattered the illusion that violence could be compartmentalized, that men trained to kill for entertainment would not one day turn that skill against their masters. Though the rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency, the fear lingered in the collective memory. What if the men who died for our amusement decided they no longer wished to play their part? What if the performance became real? The emperor's thumb, then, was not just a symbol of life and death, it was a symbol of the entire imperial bargain. In exchange for bread, spectacle, and the illusion of order, the people surrendered their right to question the system that kept them fed but powerless. They accepted that some lives were expendable, so theirs could feel secure, that the chaos of the world could be contained within the walls of the amphitheater. It was a quiet contract, renewed every time the crowd roared for blood they did not have to spill themselves. And the emperor, for his part, accepted the burden of being both father and executioner, beloved and feared, divine and deeply human. Few could bear the weight. Many cracked under it. Nero with his lyre, Caligula with his horse consul, Commodus with his club. But the system endured not because it was just, but because it worked until it didn't, until the empire grew too large, too fractured, too exhausted to maintain the illusion. What's often forgotten in the grand narratives of emperors and legions is that most emperors did not enjoy the games. Private letters, memoirs, and accounts from court insiders suggest that many found them tedious, even distasteful. A necessary evil, like tax collection or border inspections, but they attended anyway. They signaled anyway, because to absent oneself was to signal weakness, to show disgust was to alienate the mob, to delegate the decision was to appear indecisive. So they sat, hour after hour, in the heat and noise. performing the role of the all-seeing sovereign. Even as their minds wandered to grain shipments from Egypt, border skirmishes on the Rhine, or the latest plot whispered in the palace corridors. Their power was absolute, yet their freedom was minimal. The throne was a cage of its own making, gilded but inescapable. And the thumb that decided life and death was itself bound by invisible chains of expectation, tradition, and fear, and the crowd. They knew on some level that it was all theater. They knew the fights were often staged, the outcomes frequently predetermined, the emperor's mercy carefully calculated for maximum political effect. But they played along not out of ignorance, but out of need. In a world where life was short, brutal, and uncertain, where a fever could take your child, a fire your home, a debt your freedom, the arena offered something rare: clarity. Good and evil, courage and cowardice, life and death, all rendered in stark, simple terms, stripped of the moral ambiguity that plagued daily existence. It was a moral compass in a morally complex age. A story with a beginning, middle, and end that they could understand, even if they couldn't control it. And as long as the emperor held the thumb, the world made sense, if only for an afternoon. As the sun begins its slow descent on this day of games, casting long golden rays across the sand and turning the marble of the imperial box to honey, the emperor rises. The crowd falls silent, not out of fear, but out of habit, the way a congregation quiets when the priest leaves the altar. He does not speak, he does not bow, simply turns and walks away, his purple robe trailing behind him like a shadow, his sandals whispering against the stone. The signal has been given. The story is told. The city exhales. But in the quiet that follows, a question lingers, unspoken but felt by all. Who really performs for whom? Is it the gladiator who fights for the emperor's approval, risking his life for a nod? Or is it the emperor who performs mercy for the crowd's loyalty, sacrificing his authenticity for the sake of stability? In the end, both are actors, both are trapped. Both are bound by the same unbreakable script, written not in ink, but in the collective hunger for meaning in a world that offers so little of it. As dusk settles over the emptying amphitheater, the sand lies still, streaked with the day's decisions: sweat, blood, olive oil, the faint imprint of sandals. The gates close with a soft thud. The vendors pack their wares into carts, humming tunes from the day's music. And somewhere in the Palatine Hill, in a room lit by oil lamps and cooled by fountains, the emperor washes his hands not to cleanse them of blood, for he never touched it, but to prepare for the next performance. Tomorrow, the thumb will rise or fall again. The world will watch, as it always does, waiting for a sign that someone is still in control, that the chaos has not yet won. But in the silence between gestures, in the space between breaths, the truth remains. Power is not in the thumb. It is in the waiting. Imagine the moment just after a gladiator steps out of the arena, through the gate of death, but through the gate of life, his body trembling not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming physiological aftershock of having survived something his mind had already accepted as inevitable. His lungs burn with each breath, not from exertion alone, but from the sudden return of oxygen to muscles that had been clenched in anticipation of the end. The sun is lower now, casting long golden rays across the stone corridors beneath the Colosseum, and the air smells of sweat, olive oil, and the faint metallic temps of blood that clings to his skin like a second shadow, seeping into the pores, impossible to wash away completely. Around him, slaves rush to remove his armor, their hands quick but gentle, as if handling something sacred, not because he is holy, but because he has just crossed a threshold most never return from. A physician waits with vinegar and honey to clean his wounds, his fingers steady, his eyes avoiding the gladiator's gaze, not out of disrespect, but out of a quiet understanding that this man needs space to reassemble himself, to remember who he is beyond the role he just played. A scribe from the editor's office approaches with a wax tablet, stylus in hand, ready to record the outcome, Victor. Wounded but whole, and then quietly, almost shyly, a young boy steps forward, a fan, perhaps, or the son of a vendor who sold lentils near the gate of life, and offers him a small clay cup of water, his eyes wide with awe, his voice barely a whisper. "For you, sir." The gladiator takes it, nods in thanks, and for the first time all day, he allows himself to breathe not as a performer, not as a symbol, but as a man who lived when he might not have. And in that breath, he reclaims a sliver of himself that the arena had borrowed, but never owned. Fame for a gladiator was never guaranteed, but when it came, it arrived like a sudden storm, drenching him in attention he neither asked for nor fully understood, a force as disorienting as it was intoxicating. Graffiti from Pompeii tells the story better than any historian ever could. Celadus, the Thracian heartthrob of the girls, scrawled in bold letters on a tavern wall near the Stabian baths, Crescens, Netman, lover of all night. Carved into the stone rim of a public fountain where women gathered at dawn. These were not just fighters, they were personalities, icons, objects of desire, their names spoken with the same familiarity as local gods or beloved poets. Women threw flowers into the arena, not just as tribute, but as tokens of affection, roses, and violets, even sprigs of myrtle, symbols of love and fidelity. Men named their sons after them, hoping to imbue their children with the same courage, the same grace under pressure. Merchants paid them to endorse olive oil, sandals, even hair tonics. Turning their likenesses into early forms of advertising, their faces stamped onto lamps, painted on mosaics, molded into children's toys. And yet this fame was as fleeting as it was intense, as fragile as a soap bubble in the sun. A single loss could erase it. A bad day in the sand, a stumble, a moment of hesitation, a wound that slowed him down, could turn adoration into indifference, whispers of admiration into murmurs of disappointment. The crowd did not love the man. They loved the story he represented, the underdog, who defied odds, the rebel who refused to kneel, the stoic hero who faced death without flinching. And stories, as every gladiator knew from the moment he first stepped into the ludus, could be rewritten with a single stroke of the sword, a single drop of blood, a single decision from the imperial box. Fortune, too, was a fickle companion, arriving not in grand gestures but in small, unexpected increments that could either build a new life or vanish like smoke. A successful gladiator could earn prize money, sometimes a few denarii for a win, sometimes a purse large enough to buy his freedom outright, depending on the sponsor's generosity and the crowd's enthusiasm. The rudis, the wooden sword awarded as a symbol of manumission, was not just a token, it was a key to another world, a legal document carved in wood that said, "You are no longer property. You are a person again." But freedom came with its own burdens, its own quiet loneliness. Many freed gladiators found themselves adrift, no longer part of the tight-knit brotherhood of the ludus, where every meal was shared and every wound tended, yet never fully accepted by Roman society, which saw them as tainted by violence, as men who had traded their dignity for survival. They were too famous to be invisible, recognized in markets, pointed out in streets, but too marked by the arena to be trusted with respectable work. Some opened schools of their own, passing on the craft that had saved them, training the next generation not just to fight, but to survive with honor. Others disappeared into the countryside, seeking anonymity in villages that had never heard their name, where they could live as simple farmers or blacksmiths, their past buried like a secret too heavy to carry. And a few, unable to let go of the roar, the adrenaline, the certainty that for a few minutes the entire world was watching them breathe, turned to the arena as volunteers octorati, not for money, but for the only thing that made them feel truly alive, the paradoxical peace that came from standing at the edge of death and choosing to step back. But for every Celadus or Priscus whose names echoed in the streets and on the walls, there were hundreds, thousands whose names were never spoken beyond the walls of the ludus, whose faces were never carved into stone, whose stories were never written down. Men who fought once and died, their bodies dragged through the gate of death before the crowd had even stopped cheering for the previous bout. Men who fought 10 times, 20 times, and vanished into obscurity, their victories forgotten as soon as the sand was raked smooth. Men who survived but chose silence, burying their past like a wound that never fully healed, speaking of it only in dreams or in the rare drunken confession to a trusted friend. Their fame was not written on walls, but in the memories of those who trained beside them, the brother who shared his last piece of bread before a fight, the trainer who stayed up all night stitching a deep gash in his shoulder, the physician who whispered encouragement as he said a broken rib. This was a quieter kind of legacy, but no less real, no less human. Because in a world that treated them as disposable, as currency to be spent for the amusement of others, being remembered even by one person was an act of resistance. A quiet declaration that their life had mattered, if only to someone who knew their true name. The final breath, when it came, was rarely the dramatic climax the crowd imagined, the slow-motion fall with arms outstretched beneath a blood-red sunset. Most gladiators did not die in the arena. They died years later from old wounds that never fully healed, from fevers that took hold in the damp corners of provincial towns, from the slow, cumulative toll of a life lived at the edge of survival, where every meal was uncertain and every night could be the last. Some passed peacefully in their sleep, surrounded by the men who had become their family, their hands clasped in the quiet understanding that they had made it further than most. Others died alone, in foreign cities, their past unknown to those who buried them in unmarked graves, their names lost to time. And a few, like Spartacus, became myths so large their real deaths were lost to legend. Their bodies never recovered, their end rewritten by poets and politicians to serve new narratives. But for those who did fall in the sand, the end was often swift. Almost clinically sword-driven between the ribs with practiced efficiency, a hand on the chest to hold them still, a final gasp that sounded more like a sigh than a cry. The crowd might cheer or fall silent, but the sand was raked smooth within minutes. The blood absorbed by fresh layers, the story already moving on to the next act. Life, after all, did not pause for death in the arena. The show had to continue. What lingers more than the blood, or the fame, or the fortune? It's the paradox of their existence. They were both celebrated and erased, seen and unseen, valued and discarded all at once, in the same breath, by the same crowd. The state needed them to be symbols of Roman virtue or courage in the face of death, discipline in the face of chaos, loyalty to the system that owned them, but it could not afford to see them as people, as men with families, fears, and dreams. The crowd needed them to be heroes, but only as long as they stayed in their role, only as long as they performed the script written for them. The moment a gladiator stepped out of character by rebelling, by refusing to fight, by demanding more than his place, by showing too much fear or too much defiance, the illusion shattered, and with it his protection. And when the illusion broke, so did the man. Yet within that contradiction, many found a strange kind of dignity, not in defiance, but in acceptance not of their fate, but of their role within it. They knew the game, and they played it not because they believed in it, but because it was the only path available. And in playing it well, with grace, with skill, with humanity, they carved out moments of authenticity that no system could fully erase, moments that belonged only to them. Even in death, their stories were shaped by others, said, embellished, reduced to serve agendas they never chose. Emperors used their sacrifices to justify power, to prove that order required blood. Poets turned their struggles into allegories of fate and virtue. Historians reduced them to footnotes, to statistics, to cautionary tales. But in the quiet corners of the empire, in Eludus in Gaul, where a trainer still told stories of a Thracian who never lost his accent, in a tavern in Alexandria where an old man sketched a retiarius in the dust with a stick, in the scribbles of a bored schoolboy practicing his letters on a wax tablet, their names lived on, not as symbols, but as men who had once laughed over a shared bowl of barley porridge, who had bled in the training yard, who had whispered prayers in languages the gods of Rome did not understand. That is the quiet rebellion of memory. It refuses to let the system have the final word. It insists on the particular, the personal, the human, even when history demands the general, the symbolic, the useful. And yet, for all the fame and fortune some achieved, the deepest desire of most gladiators was not glory. It's not adoration, not even freedom in the grand sense, but peace. It's not to be remembered by thousands, but to be forgotten by the arena. To wake without the weight of expectation pressing down on their chest. To walk down a street without being recognized, without being pointed at, without being asked to relive their past for the amusement of strangers. To hold a child without wondering if he would one day be sold into the same life, if his strength would be seen not as a gift, but as a commodity. Freedom was not just the absence of chains. It was the presence of ordinary days without performance, without risk, without the ever-present hum of the crowd in the back of the mind. And for those who found it, even briefly, it was worth every drop of blood spilled in the sand, every night of fear, every moment of doubt. As the Roman Empire aged, the games grew more extravagant, more theatrical, more detached from their origins, but the gladiators themselves became less central, less human. Emperors preferred beast hunts, where condemned criminals were torn apart by lions, naval battles, where entire ships were sunk in flooded arenas, reenactments of myths, where actors played gods and heroes in elaborate costumes. The true gladiator, the man who fought man-to-man with skill, with honor, with a code, began to fade, replaced by condemned criminals forced to die for entertainment without training, without dignity, without a name, without even the chance to earn mercy. The brotherhood of the ludus gave way to the anonymity of the executioner's block. And with that shift, something essential was lost. The humanity that had always been the hidden core of the spectacle. The quiet understanding that even in violence there could be choice, and in choice there could be dignity. But in those final decades, when the sand was still red and the crowd still roared, there were moments fleeting, fragile, real, that no historian recorded, but that those who lived them never forgot. Moments when a gladiator looked into the eyes of his opponent and saw not an enemy, but a brother who had walked the same path, borne the same weight, dreamed the same dreams. Moments when he raised his sword not to kill, but to salute, acknowledging the courage it took to stand in the sand. Moments when he spared a life not because the emperor commanded it, it's not because the crowd demanded it, but because he chose to, because, in that instant, he remembered his own humanity and saw it reflected in the man before him. These were the moments that no poet celebrated, no emperor could control, no system could commodify. And yet they were the true heart of the arena, the blood, but the choice. Not the death, but the breath that came just before it, the breath that said, I am still here. I am still me. As dusk settles on this chapter of history, the Colosseum stands empty, its arches echoing with the ghosts of applause long faded, its sand turned to dust beneath centuries of wind and rain. The names on the walls have worn away, the mosaics have cracked. The lamps that once bore their likenesses have crumbled into shards. But somewhere, in the quiet between heartbeats, in the space between one breath and the next, the memory remains, that even in a world designed to erase them, to reduce them to symbols, to spend them like coin, men found ways to be seen not as spectacles, not as sacrifices, but as souls. And in that seeing they reclaimed something the arena could never take, their dignity. And so, as the last light fades over the silent stones, we leave them not in death, but in dignity, walking slowly out of the arena, heads high into the uncertain grace of a life they earned. One breath at a time, one choice at a time, one quiet act of humanity at a time. Imagine the Colosseum not as the postcard icon we know today, but as it stood in the quiet centuries after the last gladiator had fallen, long after the roar of the crowd had faded into silence, long after the sand had been swept clean for the final time, long after Rome itself had ceased to be the heart of an empire and had become instead a village nestled within the bones of its own past. The year is 600 CE. The Western Roman Empire has been gone for over a century. Its legions scattered, its emperors forgotten, its laws replaced by the customs of new kings who speak Germanic tongues and worship a crucified god rather than Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Yet the amphitheater still stands not because anyone maintains it with care, but because stone, unlike memory, does not easily surrender to time. Ivy climbs its arches like green fingers slowly reclaiming what was once human, wrapping itself around columns that once echoed with trumpets and chants. Goats graze in its corridors, their hooves clicking against the same stones that once trembled beneath the feet of 50,000 spectators. Children play in its shadow, inventing games with sticks and stones, reenacting battles they've heard about in fragments from their grandparents' stories, already half myth, half memory. A monk walks past, rosary in hand, his sandals whispering against the dust, glancing at the structure not with awe, but with a quiet, sorrowful reverence, seeing in its hollowed-out chambers not a monument to power, but a tomb for a civilization that forgot its own soul. And yet, even in this silence, the arena speaks not in words, not in shouts, but in symbols that have seeped so deeply into the fabric of Western imagination that we no longer recognize them as Roman at all. The raised thumb of approval, the lone figure standing in judgment, the clash of opposing forces where only one can emerge whole. These are not just relics of a dead culture. They are archetypes, reborn again and again in new forms, in new eras. Long after the empire that birthed them has turned to dust, carried forward not by historians, but by poets, playwrights, filmmakers, and ordinary people who feel, without knowing why, that there is something profoundly human about standing alone in the center of a circle and waiting for the world to decide your worth. The legacy of the gladiators did not vanish with the official end of the games in 404 CE when Emperor Honorius. Swayed by the martyrdom of Saint Telemachus, a monk who leapt into the arena to stop a fight and was stoned to death by the outraged crowd, finally banned the combats not because the empire had grown more humane, but because Christianity now, the state religion, could not tolerate a ritual that so clearly echoed pagan sacrifice, even if the blood was human rather than animal. Instead of disappearing, the spirit of the arena migrated, flowing like an underground river into the language of power, the aesthetics of performance, the psychology of the crowd. In the early Middle Ages, as Europe fractured into warring kingdoms, the tournament emerged not as a direct copy, but as a spiritual descendant. Knights trained from boyhood in the arts of war would don elaborate armor that echoed the crests and plumes of the Murmillo and Secutor, mount horses bred for speed and strength like the exotic beasts of the Venetians, and charge at each other before assembled courts of nobles and ladies. The joust was not merely sport, it was theater, ritual, and political theater all at once. A knight who fought well could win not just prize money but land, titles, the favor of a lord, or the hand of a lady. He saluted his opponent before the charge, just as the gladiator saluted the emperor. He fought not just for victory, but for honor, a concept that, like virtues in Rome, blended courage, loyalty, and public recognition. The crowd that cheered him was smaller, more exclusive, but no less invested. And the stakes, though rarely fatal after the 13th century, still carried the weight of identity. To lose was not just to be defeated, but to be diminished. The arena had not died. It had been baptized, dressed in velvet and steel, and given a new name. By the Renaissance, the gladiator returned not as warrior, but as symbol. As humanists rediscovered classical texts, artists and writers began to reimagine the Roman past not as a cautionary tale of decadence, but as a golden age of heroism and virtue. Shakespeare's Coriolanus, written in the early 1600s, presents a Roman general whose pride, military brilliance, and contempt for the common people echo the tragic isolation of the gladiator who stands apart from the mob that both adores and destroys him. Coriolanus does not fight in the sand, but in the forum, and his downfall comes not from a sword, but from words. Yet the dynamic is the same: the individual versus the collective, the exceptional man judged by the many who cannot understand him. Painters like Giovanni Battista, Tiepolo in the 18th century, and Jean Leon Gérôme in the 19th filled their canvases with scenes of Roman spectacle, not to glorify violence, but to explore the tension between individual will and collective judgment, between dignity and degradation. Germus Pauli's Verso, E Batr, with its dramatic lighting and frozen moment of decision, turned the emperor's thumb into an icon of moral ambiguity, asking the viewer, "What would you do?" In these works, the gladiator became a metaphor not for the slave or the criminal, but for the artist, the rebel, the outsider who dares to stand alone before the mob. It's offering his truth in a world that prefers comfort. And in that metaphor, the arena was no longer a physical space, but a state of being, a place where every person, at some point, must face the verdict of the world and decide whether to kneel or stand tall. The 19th century, with its revolutions, industrialization, and rising consciousness of individual rights, transformed the gladiator into a romantic hero. Lord Byron, standing before the ruins of the Colosseum in 1817, wrote in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, "While stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall." For him, the amphitheater was not a symbol of barbarism, but of endurance, the physical manifestation of a civilization that, for all its flaws, had dared to build something eternal. Charles Dickens, visiting decades later, called it a monument to the vanity of human wishes, yet he too was moved by its grandeur, by the sheer scale of human ambition it represented. But it was in literature and early theater that the gladiator truly became a figure of resistance. Novels like Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, 1834, portrayed gladiators as noble rebels, fighting not for fame, but for freedom, for love, for justice. The historical accuracy was thin, but the emotional truth resonated deeply in an age when people were fighting for democracy, abolition, and workers' rights. The gladiator became the perfect symbol for the oppressed individual rising against an unjust system. His body, once a commodity, now a vessel for moral courage. This transformation was not accidental. It was necessary. In a world where power was increasingly centralized in factories, in parliaments, in empires, the image of a single man standing in the sand, choosing how he would die, offered a powerful counter-narrative that even the most powerless could reclaim agency through dignity. That symbolism exploded in the 20th century, when cinema, perhaps the ultimate modern arena, turned the gladiator into a global icon. Ben-Hur, 1959, with its legendary chariot race, used the spectacle of the arena not for blood sport, but for moral drama. Judah Ben-Hur's victory is not just physical, but spiritual, a triumph of forgiveness over vengeance. Spartacus, Ijo Lulim. Directed by Stanley Kubrick and written by Dalton Trumbo, a screenwriter blacklisted during the McCarthy era, made the gladiator a direct stand-in for the silenced artist, the persecuted dissident. The film's most famous scene, where the enslaved men each declare "I am Spartacus" to protect their leader, is not about history. It is about solidarity in the face of erasure, about the power of collective identity when individual voices are suppressed. And then came Gladiator 2000, which fused all these threads into a single, mythic image. Maximus Decimus Meridius, the loyal general turned slave, fighting not for fame or fortune, but for the simple human right to return home, to be reunited with his family in death, if not in life. The film was not history, but it was truth of a different kind. It captured the enduring appeal of the gladiator, not as a killer, but as a man who chooses how he will die, and in that choice reclaims his life. The sand becomes sacred ground, not because of the blood spilled on it, but because of the humanity that flickers within it. Today the legacy lives on, in ways both obvious and invisible, woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. Modern sports stadiums, with their tiered seating, their roaring crowds, star athletes traded like commodities for millions, are direct architectural and psychological descendants of the amphitheater. The thumbs-up emoji, used billions of times a day across the globe, is a digital echo of the emperor's gesture, now stripped of its lethal power, but still carrying the weight of judgment, of approval, of belonging. Reality television, with its manufactured conflicts, its voting audiences, its weekly eliminations, replicates the arena's core dynamic. Ordinary people placed under pressure, their emotions commodified, their fates decided by strangers who feel invested in their story. Even political discourse has adopted the language of the games. Opponents are destroyed in debates. Candidates battle for votes. Elections are bloodbaths. Social media is perhaps the most pervasive modern arena, a space where reputations are made and destroyed with a single post, where the crowd's verdict is instant and irreversible, where everyone is both performer and spectator, judge and judged. The arena did not disappear. It evolved. And in that evolution, we see not just the past, but ourselves, our hunger for drama, our need for heroes, our complicity in the spectacle we consume. And yet, beneath these modern echoes, something quieter and more profound persists. The memory of the brotherhood, the dignity in the face of erasure, the choice to spare when one could kill. These are the legacies that do not make headlines, but shape souls. In prisons around the world, men form bonds not unlike those in the Luda, sharing food, protecting each other, finding dignity in a system designed to strip it away. In protest movements, individuals stand alone before power, not with swords, but with signs, with songs. With silence, knowing they may be crushed, but choosing to stand anyway, offering their bodies as a testament to a truth larger than themselves. In hospitals, soldiers, and even classrooms, people face their own arenas every day, not with the roar of a crowd, but with the quiet courage of those who know the stakes and step forward anyway.
Ow.
The gladiator's true legacy is not the violence, but the humanity that flickered within it, the stubborn refusal to be reduced to a role, to be seen only as a body, to be forgotten. It is the insistence that even in the darkest stages, a person can choose how they will be remembered. What is remarkable is not that the arena endured, but that its symbols were so easily repurposed, inverted, reclaimed. The Romans built it to control, to distract, to reinforce hierarchy, to remind the people that power flowed from the top down and that their role was to watch, to cheer, to obey. But over time, the people took those symbols and turned them inside out. The thumb that once meant death now means like a gesture of connection rather than judgment. The fighter who once represented imperial power now represents resistance, the underdog, the truth teller. The sand that once absorbed blood now symbolizes the stage where anyone can prove their worth, not to an emperor, but to themselves. This is the alchemy of memory. It does not preserve the past as it was, but reshapes it to meet the needs of the present. And in that reshaping, the gladiator becomes not a relic, but a mirror reflecting back to us our own struggles, our own choices, our own quiet acts of courage. Even the Colosseum itself has been transformed, not just by time, but by meaning. Once a site of death, it is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A Christian shrine, Pope Benedict XIV consecrated it in the 18th century as a memorial to Christian martyrs. Though historical evidence for mass martyrdom, there is thin, and a global icon of resilience. Tourists walk its corridors not to cheer, but to reflect, to feel the weight of history in their bones. Candlelight vigils are held in its center to honor victims of modern violence, refugees, victims of war, the disappeared. Its arches appear on coins, postcards, and protest signs, not as a celebration of empire, but as a warning, a reminder, a call to remember what happens when human life becomes spectacle. When the crowd's entertainment is purchased with someone else's suffering, the stone has not changed, but the story we tell about it has, Andy, that change is itself a form of redemption. And yet the tension remains unresolved, humming beneath the surface of our modern lives. We condemn the games as barbaric, yet we stream fights online. We binge true crime. We devour stories of suffering packaged as entertainment. We praise the gladiator's courage, yet we mock vulnerability in public life. We cancel those who stumble. We demand perfection from our heroes. We visit the Colosseum in silence, moved by its grandeur and its tragedy. Yet we create new arenas every day in our digital lives, where reputations are made and destroyed with a single post, where the crowd's verdict is instant and irreversible, where the line between performer and person blurs until it vanishes. The arena did not disappear, it evolved. And in that evolution, we see not just the past, but ourselves, our contradictions, our complicity, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion. As dusk settles over the ancient stones, the wind moves through the arches like a sigh, carrying with it the echoes of centuries. The tourists have gone, the lights are dim, but the symbols remain chid in stone, in language, in the way we gather, judge, and remember. The empire is gone, the sand is dust, but the echo of the crowd that never left. It lives in the stadium, in the courtroom, in the comment section, in the quiet moment when we ask ourselves, what would I have done? And in that question, the arena is reborn, not as a place of blood, but as a space of reflection. And so, as we prepare to step into the next chapter of this story, we carry with us not just the memory of violence, but the quiet persistence of meaning, how even the darkest stages can give rise to light. If someone dares to stand in the center and say, not I am Spartacus, but simply, I am still here. Imagine standing before the Colosseum not as a tourist with a camera, but as a pilgrim with a question, one that has no clear answer, only echoes. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, and the air is thick with the scent of dust, distant traffic, and the faint aroma of espresso from a cafe nearby. Around you, people move in slow circles, some reading plaques, others whispering to children, a few simply sitting on the worn steps, eyes closed, as if listening for something beneath the noise of the modern city. No one is shouting. No one is reenacting battles. There's no sand, no blood, no roar of a crowd. And yet, something lingers, a presence, a weight, a quiet hum that seems to rise from the ground itself. This is not memory as fact, but memory as feeling, the slow, patient accumulation of centuries of human reflection, regret, admiration, and sorrow, all gathered around a space that once hosted the most public of deaths. The gladiators are long gone, their names mostly lost, their bones scattered, their voices silenced. But we keep coming back not to celebrate what happened here, but to ask why we remember it at all, and what that remembering says about us. For centuries after the games ended, the Colosseum was not revered, it was reused. In the early Middle Ages, it became a quarry, its travertine blocks carted away to build churches, palaces, and city walls. Families moved into its arches, turning vaulted corridors into homes, stables, even workshops. The arena floor collapsed, revealing the labyrinthine hypogeum below. Where animals and fighters once waited in darkness, vines crept over the seats. Trees took root in the cracks. The structure was not preserved out of respect, but ignored out of necessity. Ohm had other concerns: plague, invasion, the slow unraveling of civic life. And in that neglect, something unexpected happened. The arena lost its power to frighten. Without the crowd, without the blood, without the emperor's thumb, it became just another ruin, a beautiful, haunting shell, but no longer a machine of control. It was in this emptiness that reverence could begin to grow, not as a celebration of violence, but as a meditation on what violence leaves behind: silence, stone, and the question of how a civilization that built aqueducts and wrote poetry could also build arenas where men killed for sport. The shift from ruin to relic began in earnest during the Renaissance, when humanists and artists returned to Rome not to plunder, but to learn. They measured the arches, sketched the columns, and wrote poems about the noble decay of ancient monuments. For them, the Colosseum was not a symbol of barbarism, but of grander proof that even in death, Rome had built something eternal. But their admiration was selective. They celebrated the engineering, the symmetry, the scale, but rarely the purpose. The gladiators themselves were either ignored or romanticized as noble savages, their suffering softened into myth. It was easier to admire the container than to confront what it once held. This pattern would repeat for centuries. We love the Colosseum, but we look away from the sand. We build museums around gladiator armor, but we rarely ask whose body it once protected or whose it failed. Memory, it seems, is not about truth, but about what we are willing to carry. By the 18th century, the Grand Tour turned the Colosseum into a moral classroom. Wealthy Europeans, British aristocrats, German scholars, American idealists would stand in its shadow and reflect on the rise and fall of empires, using Rome as a mirror for their own societies. "See what pride hath wrought," they would say, as if the arena were a warning against excess rather than a product of systemic choices. Painters like Piranesi captured its grandeur in etchings that emphasized scale over suffering, light over shadow. And yet even in these sanitized views, a quiet unease remained. Visitors would often describe a feeling of melancholy, a sense of being watched by the stones themselves. This was not guilt, exactly, but a dawning awareness that the past is not dead. It is present, waiting to be interpreted, and every interpretation says more about the interpreter than the interpreted. The 19th century brought archaeology, and with it, a more honest reckoning. Excavations revealed the hypogeum, the underground network of tunnels, cages, and lifts that made the spectacles possible. Scholars began to study graffiti, inscriptions, and legal texts, piecing together the lives of real gladiators, their diets, their contracts, their nicknames, their brotherhoods. For the first time, they were seen not as faceless warriors, but as people, some enslaved, some free, all caught in a system that demanded their performance. Museums filled with artifacts. A bronze ochreia shin guard, etched with the name Flamma, a tombstone showing a gladiator holding his rudis. A mosaic depicting a fight with the caption, Priscus versus Virasequel, after many rounds. These objects did not glorify violence, they humanized it. And in that humanization, reverence took a new form, not awe at the spectacle, but respect for the resilience of those who survived it, and sorrow for those who did not. In the 20th century, the Colosseum became a Christian shrine. Pope Benedict XIV consecrated it in 1744 as a sacred site in honor of early Christian martyrs. Though historical evidence for mass martyrdom there is scant, still, the gesture was powerful. It transformed the arena from a place of pagan sacrifice into a monument of faith and suffering. Every Good Friday, the Pope leads a torchlit procession around its perimeter, stopping to pray at stations that commemorate Christ's passion, but also, implicitly, all who have suffered unjustly. This act of reconsecration did not erase the past. It layered it, adding another voice to the chorus of memory. Now, the Colosseum is not just Roman, not just Christian, but universal, a symbol of human cruelty and human redemption held in tension. Today we remember the gladiators in fragments. School children learn about them in simplified lessons that focus on armor types and famous fights, rarely on the economics of slavery or the psychology of the crowd. Tourists take selfies in front of reconstructed gates, unaware that the gate of life was named not for joy, but for the rare mercy of survival. Documentaries dramatize their battles with slow-motion swordplay, but skip the quiet moments in the ludicrous's shared meals. The whispered prayers, the hands that helped a fallen brother to his feet. And yet, beneath these surface-level memories, a deeper current flows. In online forums, historians debate the ethics of the games. In art installations, contemporary creators use gladiator imagery to comment on modern exploitation of athletes, of workers, of prisoners. The gladiator has become a flexible symbol, reshaped to fit the anxieties of each new generation. And in that reshaping, we reveal our own values, what we condemn, what we admire, what we refuse to see. What is most striking is how the act of remembering has itself become a ritual. We do not just visit the Colosseum, we perform reverence, we speak in hushed tones, we touch the stones as if seeking a connection. We leave flowers, notes, or coins in quiet corners, not as offerings to Mars, but as gestures of solidarity with the unknown dead. This is not historical accuracy, it is emotional truth. We may never know the name of the man who bled in this spot, but we feel his absence, and in feeling it, we honor him. Memory, in this sense, is not about fact, it is about empathy. It is the quiet insistence that even the forgotten deserve to be mourned, and yet the tension remains. We build memorials to the gladiators while ignoring modern arenas, prisons, sweatshops, refugee camps where people still perform for survival. We call the games barbaric, yet we stream reality shows where humiliation is entertainment. We revere the Colosseum as a monument to the past, but we rarely ask what our own monuments will say about us. The act of remembering is not neutral. It is a choice. And every time we choose to remember the gladiator as a hero rather than a victim, as a symbol rather than a person, we participate in the same erasure that began the day the sand was first raked smooth. But there is hope in the way memory evolves. In recent years, historians have begun to center the voices of the marginalized, the enslaved, the provincial, the unnamed. Archaeologists use DNA and isotopic analysis to trace where gladiators came from, revealing a mosaic of origins: Thrace, Gaul, North Africa, even Rome itself. Museums now include exhibits on the Lanastay, the crowd, the politics of the games, not just the fighters. And in classrooms, teachers ask students not who won, but why did this happen? This is a slower, harder kind of reverence, one that does not flinch from complexity, that honors the past by refusing to simplify it. As dusk settles over the Colosseum, the lights come on, casting a golden glow on the ancient stones. The last tourists leave. The city hums in the distance. But the memory remains not as a single story, but as a chorus of voices. The gladiator who whispered a prayer in his native tongue, the slave who swept the sand, the mother who wept for her son, the monk who tried to stop the violence, the artist who painted the truth, the child who asks, why? This is how we remember. Not perfectly, not completely, but persistently. No. And in that persistence, the gladiators live not as legends, but as reminders that every life, no matter how brief or brutal, leaves a mark on the world. And so, As we prepare to step into the final chapter of this story, we carry with us not just the image of the arena, but the weight of memory itself, how it distorts, how it heals, how it connects us across centuries to those who, like us, were simply trying to survive, to be seen, to be remembered. The stones are silent, but if we listen closely, they whisper back. And so, dear listener, our journey through the dust and echoes of the arena comes to a close. Thank you for staying with me through the quiet mornings in the ludus, the roar of the crowd at midday, the weight of the emperor's thumb, and the silence that followed the final breath. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. You didn't need to memorize names or dates. You didn't need to take notes or stay alert. You only needed to be here, present, breathing alongside the story as it unfolded. And in that simple act of presence, you honored not just the gladiators, but the very humanity we've been tracing through the sand. Fragile, resilient, and worthy of remembrance. Let the story settle now, like the last embers of a fading fire, glowing softly before they turn to ash. If your eyes have grown heavy, if your thoughts have drifted into dreams, if you've already begun to slip into the quiet space between wakefulness and sleep, that's exactly how it should be. This was never meant to be a lecture, nor a performance demanding your full attention. It was meant to be a companion, a voice in the dark, a hand on your shoulder. A gentle reminder that even the most distant past is woven into the fabric of who we are today. The Colosseum may stand in ruins, the names of most fighters may be lost to time, but the questions they left behind, the ones about dignity, spectacle, power, and choice, still live in us. And they will keep living. Not in textbooks, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the person behind the performance, when we lower our thumb not in judgment, but in mercy. Now it's your turn to rest not just your body, but your mind. Let go of the day's worries, the tomorrow's tasks, the noise of the world outside. Imagine the sand of the arena smoothed by the evening breeze, the last light of the sun gilding the arches of the amphitheater, the distant murmur of the Tiber flowing as it has for thousands of years. The fighters are gone. The crowd has dispersed. But the stones remember, and so do you. Carry their echoes with you not as a burden, but as a whisper, that even in the darkest arenas of life, there is room for courage, for brotherhood, for grace. And when you wake, whether in an hour or tomorrow, you'll carry that whisper into your own world, into your work, your relationships, your quiet acts of kindness. That is how memory becomes meaning. That is how history stays alive. If you'd like, I'd be honored to keep you company another night. Perhaps we'll walk the moonlit streets of ancient Athens, or sit by the banks of the Nile as the pyramids rise in the distance. Maybe we'll listen to the wind through the ruins of Pompeii, or follow the footsteps of a philosopher through the olive groves of Delphi. These stories are always here, waiting not to teach, not to impress, but simply to share. So if you feel the pull, come back. The past is patient. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It only asks that, when you're ready, you listen softly, slowly, without expectation. Rest now, dear listener. Rest now, fighter. The sand is still. The world is quiet. It's quiet and you are safe.